Thank you, Pamela. I'm very excited to talk to everybody today about some of the research and analysis we've done in this area of digital content locally held by libraries and other cultural heritage organizations and preservation of, of it. As Pamela mentioned, I'm happy to answer questions. Feel free to type them into the box as we go. I will do my best. I'll even try and answer them as we go. It's a little tricky to sort of pay attention to the question box and give the presentation, so we'll answer them afterwards as well at the end. You should also feel free to reach out to me. There's some contact information in the presentation, which you'll have on hand, and so I'm happy to talk at any time. Also on the announcement front, you can get the slides as they exist now, plus a handout at this URL. Let me flip over here and just show. There's nothing too exciting here. There were a number of areas where I sort of had a lot of things to say, and I didn't want to put all the text on the screen. It doesn't work very well. So feel free to go there. Contact information is there also. The ALCTS version of the slide set will probably be better, especially if I think that they're recording it, so there'll be an audio, and so that'll make a lot more sense, I suspect. So feel free to go grab that. I might refer to the handout as we go. You certainly don't need it while we're talking. To continue with the background information, I do work for Ithaca. Ithaca is a not-for-profit organization that helps the academic community take advantage of digital technologies. Ithaca has 3 public-facing services: Ithaca S&R, JSTOR, and Portico. Portico was the recipient of the grant and did a lot of the research that went into the analysis we're going to talk about today. Portico is a digital archive, and it's a community-supported archive. We, at the moment, are targeted specifically at scholarly publications primarily, and have quite a chunk of content committed to the archive. So one of the things that went into, sort of prompted this research was this phrase that everyone I think has heard: anyone can be a publisher. Or as it's sometimes said, everyone is a publisher in this day and age. We know this is true with the greater community, and there hasn't been more writing or more reading, I suspect, in history than there is now, with the sort of proliferation of blogs and whatnot, digital content. It's just as true, and perhaps in a more sophisticated way, at our cultural heritage organizations and our libraries. This is a slide that came from a survey that OCLC did last year, and they were specifically talking to academic research libraries, and asked, one of the questions in the survey was asking about digitization digitization of special collections. And the survey found that 78% of those surveyed had completed a digitization project of their special collections, and only 3% hadn't done any digitization projects yet. That's a tremendous number in my mind. So as one result of this, the NEH and IMLS awarded a grant to Portico in partnership with Cornell to develop a practical model for preservation, specifically of digitized books. Although one of the things that we found as we were talking to people and looking at lots and lots of samples of content is that digital content tends to look similar. At its sort of base level, any object is represented by some metadata and some files, and you know, that combination of things can give you a digital song or a digital album or a journal article or a journal issue or all sorts of things. But this framework of what are the building blocks of a digital object is the same. And so a lot of what we learned as we talked to institutions and thought about it was felt applicable across a broad spectrum of digital content and not just limited to digitized books. There were 2 studies where we had gathered data that we used in the analysis that went into the white paper we produced as a result of the NEH grant and is behind the presentation here. One was a study that we did, Portico did, with the Digital Preservation Coalition and the University of London Computing Center for JISC, to look at 16 JISC-funded digitization projects, and specifically to look at their preservation plans. And then we also spoke with about 14 institutions of, these were all for the Portico locally created content study, these were all academic libraries of varying sizes and in a variety of geographical locations, to talk to them about what content they had and what its preservation needs for. And we were looking into and thinking about whether or not there was a business model that could be developed that would allow Portico to help meet some of these preservation needs. The survey tools we used for both studies were very similar. We did them at about the same time, so they informed one another. So it made sense to combine the data when sort of thinking about the analysis of, okay, what have we learned in talking to institutions? The JISC information was really interesting because they're such a broad spectrum of cultural heritage organizations, from national libraries through academic libraries. It even included a museum, which had some sort of fascinating factors associated with its content. So that's where when I start talking about numbers, that's where the information sort of arose, was from our discussions with these institutions. And you know, one of the things we encountered as we were talking to people are these questions of, well, what should we do? The IT department is backing it up. You know, how safe is it? And how safe does it need to be? And you know, it's unfortunate that the answer is that it depends. It depends an awful lot on the needs of the community for whom it was digitized. You know, what the investment was in the digitization effort, whether or not the content could be re-digitized. Some of the institutions we spoke with, you know, when we talked about this, like, oh yeah, we don't care. You know, if it goes away, we'll re-digitize. I, you know, got a never-ending supply of students who'll sit at the scanner and do this. But in other instances, the answer was, oh no, no, no. You know, if we digitized it again, it's too fragile. That couldn't happen. Well, those are two organizations who have different needs. Maybe content that looks exactly the same, but has very different protection needs. Which comes to, I like to talk about content protection, and in this regard, there's sort of a continuum where you take no action, where on one end there is no action, and then on the other end is this concept of full managed preservation. Portico and JSTOR, we put ourselves on that end of the continuum, and that's an appropriate place for the content that's in our care. But there's a whole range of content that's got different communities and different needs, and some analysis of what those needs are will help decide where on this continuum one wants to land. Backup is well known. We're going to talk about it a little bit later about thinking about backup solutions. It's absolutely necessary for business continuity. Many organizations can get it from their parent organization, and wonderfully nowadays it's a commodity service. So it's relatively easy to get in a variety of formats. Byte replication is a little bit more robust than straight up backup because you're making a sort of an exact copy of each piece of content and putting it somewhere else, which means that sort of swapping content, swapping hard drives in and out is much easier, and there's usually no need for software mediation in between. There's not special backup software one needs to get a hold of to pull out the incremental copy and join it with the last full copy that sometimes one encounters with backup. So another sort of purely visual way to think about this in regard to the amount of protection one can get and where any particular content wants to fall here or should fall here is dependent upon many factors. We're gonna talk about some of those. And before we talk about some of those, we're gonna dig into. I'm gonna talk about the definition that Ithaca applies uses for full managed digital preservation. This definition actually lives on my whiteboard, much to the dismay of my children who are forced to scribble along the edges. And we've defined digital preservation for our purposes. And in fact, this was the definition that was used in both studies when we were looking at all of the organizations. Digital preservation is a series of management policies and activities necessary to ensure the enduring usability, authenticity, discoverability, and accessibility of content over the very long term. I want to emphasize the very long term. That is perhaps the one characteristic that distinguishes full managed digital preservation from many other activities. It's the time horizon. So some of the goals there, usability. And this is about ensuring that content that's taken into a repository or preservation service today, that in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, X 100 years, is usable. And there's a set of sort of an understanding, at least, that is necessary about the content that's going into the repository. You need to know what you have, and you need to know what it is so that you can plan for how to manage it. Another goal is authenticity, is being able to state with authority that the thing you're delivering today is in fact a true, an authentic copy of the intellectual content that was put in the archive back at the beginning of time. And content is not static. It will be updated. It will need to be changed. Page 4 wasn't page 4. It was actually page 5. That will need to be fixed. And so being able to track that and so that you can state with authority, yes, no, I know this to be true. I think I'm talking to a room full of librarians, so I won't beat the discoverability goal over the head too much here, but you have to find it again. Otherwise, one could end up with a disk drive full of metadata files and content files, and not enough knowledge to know what belongs to what and why and how to do anything with it. So that descriptive bibliographic metadata is key. And then accessibility. Eventually, this content is being preserved because there's an expectation that at some point it will need to be delivered. And so there has to be some facility for sort of retrieving it from the archive or the repository and making it available to the appropriate community. And so that's the definition whenever we start talking about full managed digital preservation. This is the definition that drives those discussions. So it's a beautiful definition. I'm very happy with the definition. I'm very proud of the definition. On the other hand, one could look at that definition and go, okay, so but tomorrow I need to do something about this 2 terabytes of content. And so what are some steps that can take? I'm going to list a few, and they seem a little simplistic, but this was actually, these are recommendations based upon the conversations we had. And so they include locating all the content. And by this we mean not just, well, the content's in the repository, but also the high-resolution master images or audio files are on an external hard drive in Joe's file cabinet. And the master copy of the metadata, the robust metadata, is actually in a MARC record in the OPAC. And so those 2 places sort of also are important in consideration to the repository. And one of the things we found was that as we talked to people using the survey tool really helped sort of elicit this. So where is all of it? Oh, okay, and thinking about that. Initiate regular backups, and again, not just of the repository, but of all of the sort of ancillary stuff that is probably just as important over the long term, or even the medium term. You know, this is test retrieval from the backups. It's just a good rule of thumb to make sure we know how to get content back out again. And then, see, I had originally put develop a long-term preservation plan in here, and then I thought, oh, because what we're actually talking about here is actually develop a preservation plan. And one element of that preservation plan will be to say how long-term it needs to be. It may be that 5 years is sufficient for your purposes, or maybe 10 or 20, or maybe it's, you know, we want to keep it safe for 5 years and then we're going to reassess. And making those decisions will be part of the planning process. I'm going to take a little bit of a walk through some of the things we learned and some of the themes, I guess, we gathered as we talked to institutions. And we'll do that, and then we'll dig into preservation modeling. This was sort of how things laid out. Vast majority of the institutions we talked to had digital collections that consisted of digitized special collections, followed closely by images, whether those were photographs or art slides. This general categorization and layout matches what we've seen in other surveys. In 2006, Ithaca and SNR did a survey looking at digitized content at libraries, and 71% of those collections were special collections that had been digitized, and 70% were images. So that percentage rings true, sort of across the board as to what our peers are doing. This is really interesting. We talked with 27 institutions, and it probably included at least 30 different projects. We're using 36 distinct pieces of software. That's a lot. There were 94 instances of that software, and if you do the math, that works out to about over 3 sort of instantiations of software to manage this content on average at each institution. And when you lay that out against sort of the variety of institutions, that's quite a burden, especially on some smaller institutions, to try and manage that much software in the background. And that here's another way of looking at it. In general, everyone was running some type of a repository. You can also see that most institutions, that part of their content management stack, shall we say, was using a file server, straight up disks. and so how it broke out. You can actually see a list of all of the 34 different pieces of software and the rates at which each was used in the white paper, and also I think I put it in the handout if you want to see what your peers are actually using in terms of software. So what does all of that software mean in regard to actual content? If we think of this cloud as being an object, it's got a whole lot of files in it, and they end up in different places. So the high-resolution masters or images are off on CD or DVD or external hard drive somewhere, hopefully in a machine room, but a lot of times, you know, they were in a file cabinet somewhere. There's usually a set of rendition-ready, web-ready images that can be found in the repository. Co-located with that would be a brief metadata record. Usually Dublin Core is what's used, and anyone who's used Dublin Core knows how weak it is, that its strength is sort of in its weakness. PDF, you know, is usually some type of PDF rendition, another rendition of it, of that object, and then some sort of an XML representation of that content to pull all of this together. In most instances, the libraries or the cultural heritage organizations aren't constructing that by hand. It is something that the repository is managing, but it does exist, and it is the way that these pieces are all put together. And then there's usually a robust metadata record, often in the catalog. One of the challenges here is the fact that the content is so dispersed and not co-located. The financial investment that an institution often puts in is off here it's off in those DVDs or that external hard drive. That's where you pay the student or you outsource to have something digitized, and where if those DVDs become corrupted and you had to redigitize, that's where the expense would be. But this is oftentimes the hardest thing to preserve or back up because it's not integrated in any way with any of the systems. And so that the fact that it's so dispersed, the fact that it's so difficult to pull all of these elements together is one of the biggest risk factors. So some of the other themes we encountered, collaboration. Every institution we spoke with was collaborating. They were either collaborating with another department within their organization or collaborating with an external entity. But there was not a single project that didn't involve at least two departments or two separate entities. At the time of this, we did the surveys, and we're now pushing about 18 months. Most projects didn't have a preservation policy associated with it. A number had policies being developed either by the library or sometimes more broadly within the entire parent organization. But at the time of the surveys, very few could sort of produce one and say, ah, yes, here's the document. Some additional themes we encountered. That the size of the cultural heritage organization wasn't a predictor for risk or for the amount of content. It was fascinating. We were speaking with one institution. It was a very small academic library who is and they were very oh, we don't have much. Oh my goodness, there was like the biggest amount of images we'd seen in talking to anybody that they were managing and had a relatively robust content management system to handle. Many institutions outsourced access, and to the extent that they did any preservation, that there simply wasn't something that could be managed in-house, that they could set aside staff time to handle. This is more, we're now more analysis than summary. but it really felt like many institutions would benefit from some sort of a turnkey solution that provided both access and preservation. Again, sort of getting at for the same reason that many are outsourcing access now. And then, this wasn't surprising, but worth noting that folks don't have sustainability plans for this content. For many institutions, this is just another outlet for their their special collections. And so it falls sort of under that same rubric of providing access to our content. And that was sort of interesting to see. So again, we'll go back to what can you do immediately, and we've got our sort of list of four statements here. The last bullet, number 4, developer preservation plan, in the handout and also in the white paper, there's a list of 20 questions that fall into these 5 categories, and that's the advice we give to people. We built those questions based upon the survey tools because it took us a number of iterations on those tools to get to a point where we were sort of eliciting enough information to understand what was happening and be able to then make statements about it. And so we essentially turn those survey tools into this list of 20 questions, which I really think is a really good place to start when thinking about preservation planning and what to do with content and how to protect it. And it involves identifying, who created the content and who has long-term responsibility for it. Just sort of writing down what the collection is, digitized slides from Professor X, Y, or Z, World War II postcards that came from this collection donated by so-and-so. That description will help plan for it for the long term. Again, documenting all of the places it exists. And then thinking about, how long it needs to be protected for and what's the impact of loss. So if the disks go, how bad is that for you? If it's not bad, then maybe you're done. And then sort of just documenting, and it doesn't have to be real detailed, but like how content management and preservation tasks will occur. And so those 20 questions are in the handout. They're in the white paper also. So I'm going to not exactly digress here, but within this list of questions, one of the things you sort of want to get at is thinking about the difference between collection management and content management. One of the sort of standard processes for building a digitized collection is that the institution gets funding to go do a digitization project and do a lot of planning and spend their 2 years doing the digitization, pulling together this beautiful content and this wonderful service, and then but it's considered static, and there's sort of expected to be this bow tied on it at the end, when in fact it will need to be maintained over time. And there's sort of 2 aspects of that maintenance, and this will come out when we talk about preservation also. There's ongoing collection management and ongoing content management. And I define collection management as sort of as being a task that's typically done by a subject specialist. And so this is when the user comes and says, this image doesn't match its metadata. This is not the Mona Lisa. This is a different painting. And the subject specialist needs to then go in and identify that and determine it and figure out a way to fix it. And that will happen. It will continue to happen even on static collections. That is separate, and a separate set of activities from the content management, and that is the set of activities around the fact that every 3 to 5 years you'll need to replace the hardware on which this runs. The repository system may have a new release that needs to be installed, or you're going to pull out of Content DM and put into something else. And so there's another set of sort of more technical activities that need to go on in parallel. And they don't end. And when thinking about content over the long term and preservation over the long term, these are two really key elements to think about. Who has those responsibilities, and to whose job description are these two things written? So if one of our first things is backup, it's really useful when thinking about backup solutions to keep in mind why one backs up. And there's really two driving reasons. One is disaster recovery. And this is when a tornado takes out your machine room, or anything else dramatic and big. And you can think about, in that scenario, recovering your data probably doesn't have to be fast, because you're not going to have anywhere to put it until you drain all the water out of the machine room and buy new hardware. So, and it probably doesn't have to be current. If you eventually, when you get your machine room back in order, load up content and lose 2 weeks of work on digitization, over the grand scheme of how much time you're spending rebuilding from this disaster, that's probably not really important. But the other thing backups are used for is user error recovery, and this is when I accidentally delete a file, or the mouse gets away and you drag a directory somewhere, you can't find it again, and you need to pull it back. And in that scenario, currency of the content is really important, because you don't want to try and figure out what actions you took on those 2 files over the past 3 weeks. That would be a nightmare. And you need it to come back pretty fast. One of the problems when thinking about backup is that those are 2 separate lists of requirements we just talked about. And so some institutions may find that a single backup solution isn't sufficient, that in fact you sort of need 2 solutions to get at your 2 needs. So this is my backup is not as easy as you think slide. Or I should rephrase that. Backup is not as easy as I once thought slide. It's not really 1 + 1 = 2. It's more like blah, 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 blah equals 2. And in the handout, there is also a list of concepts to think about when considering what the right backup solution is. There are lots of solutions, from what your parent organization offers, to one of the commodity in the cloud services, to writing backup tapes every 6 months and shipping them to Iron Mountain. And thinking, so there's a list of questions and sort of facts to think about when making that decision, and that's in the handout. And that's everything from, your speed of retrieval, how fast do you need this content to come back if it goes away, what replication and backup you already have sort of built into your hardware or into your repository system as it is. And so we can sort of put that in context, thinking about what some options are. So this brings us to preservation, which is my bread and butter. And we're going to talk a little bit. No discussion of preservation can be complete without the open archival information system. And slide, and this is I'm sure most people have in fact seen this slide in the past, and it is the big takeaways. This was work done, gosh, it must have been over a decade ago now, to sort of define at a really high level what a preservation system or an archival information system looks like. And what I think the big facts, the big takeaways are here, are that there must be preservation planning, and it sort of happens constantly and it's ongoing, that the archive requires ongoing administration, and again, it's ongoing. It keeps going and going and going. That content in the form of metadata and files comes into the archive and it goes out of the archive. The archive is not exactly a static place, or it's not a locked box. Things go in and things come out all the time. The archive is not hardware or software. Those are elements of the archive, but the actual archive itself involves a whole lot of people. That the original producer of the content and the eventual users of the content have to have input into the archive and how it's managed and what's going on. And that at its very base, the content preserved is both the content, the files, and metadata about the content. And they're both necessary. So this is sort of another picture of the same thing. This is one possible flow for preservation. Some organizations may find that it makes more sense for archive and delivery to be co-located, or for the archive and processing to be co-located. But in general, these are the steps we believe are important in preservation. Receiving content is going to come in all different sorts of ways, probably. Processing the content, and then eventually reprocessing the content. Whether that's because your content producer, your publisher, made changes to something that they've already given you once, whether it's because you've, during your archive management stage, found corrupted files that need to be replaced. All sorts of things might happen that may cause you to reprocess content. There's the ongoing archive management, which is making sure those replicas and backups are working. You know, migrating the hardware and the software is needed. Just sort of keeping an eye on everything, keeping it running. There's the content export, getting it out again to users, and then sort of overall is the preservation planning. And this can sort of, this falls into my pretty flower here, this pretty flower of these sort of 6 steps involved in preservation planning. And we're going to dig in a little bit, I'm going to try and do it in 5 minutes, into some sort of more specifics about some of these. So preservation cannot be done with hardware and software. There's no software package that you buy and voila, content is preserved. It just requires too much people knowing what's going on. However, it requires technology. In that way, it's very different from the print world, where staff could go put those books on the shelves and you could monitor the temperature and the humidity levels and keep the bugs out, and things were good. Nowadays, you need the technology to help you file the bits. So when thinking about selecting software, and this is a list of questions that we came up with just sort of from talking to people, you really need to think about throughput. How much content's going in and how much is going out, and can the system you're looking at handle that? This was a very common comment when we talked to people. There were a couple of repository systems where folks couldn't batch load the way they felt they needed. And so thinking about what your throughput needs and whether or not the software can meet that. And then, thinking about how complicated it is to manage and whether or not it's something you can actually do and can dedicate the staff for. As part of your analysis when looking at content, an organization will come up with a set of preservation metadata, the things they think are important to capture. And so there's a really good question there of can the system that you're looking at capture the metadata that you think is important? And then this is sort of getting at that co-location issue. Can you get those master copies of the content into the repository, or is it going to bomb at a terabyte? And again, can you export the whole package out again? Very, very, very few of the organizations we spoke with could send us a single package containing all of the content for a thing, for an object that was preserved. And this is important because you will need to move it, and you will need to move it as a whole, and you will need to associate those rendition copies with the master copies, and this test of can you move it is really important. Very, very few organizations we talk to could actually do that. And then costs, of course, both on startup and annual. Nothing too surprising there, but important to think about. And both staff costs as well as software costs. Community monitoring. This is something to think about because preservation is in my experience highly collaborative. It is not something that an organization can do alone. And certainly you can't do it all alone. You know, there will be areas of expertise, and working with others to make that happen is really important. So we can take the Jove work as an example. Jove is a tool for characterizing files and saying, oh, this matches its file format or it doesn't, and this is why it doesn't. And it's been designed so that lots of different people can build modules for specific file types, which is really and being able to share that development is just key. So community monitoring. One element of any preservation model needs to be paying attention to what the file format experts are doing for the content that you're preserving, the types of content you're preserving, what the preservation experts are doing. What your content provider community needs, and what your designated user community needs. And these are all sort of four key elements in sort of staying abreast of what's going on and getting our best collaborative bang for our buck. On that vein of thinking about what to monitor is thinking about what goes into the archive. What contents go into the archive, what formats go into the archive. Some of the people we spoke with just limited it, said we put PDFs in the archive in our repository and that's it. Other folks accept everything. You can sort of get at this. The reality is that even if you accept everything, which I actually advise, I think is good because we don't want our preservation to limit our innovation. Well, I don't know how to preserve that thing, so don't give it to me. That it's better to say, okay, we'll take it all, but this set of things here, and we'll write it down. This set of things will get less preservation because we don't know what to do with it yet. But this set of things we can do. And this is another area where that collaboration and monitoring the community and participating in the community is really important. Preservation policies, really important to just write it down, what your decisions are. There's an actual template that looks like this, which is actually what we use at Portico at that place where you got the handout. My advice is always for the policy statement to be relatively high level, and then you can have really specific implementation examples. And if your policy statement is relatively philosophical and you get it all approved, then you don't have to go back and approve again. Which is, if you need to change the examples, which can be really helpful. We also, in the handout, there's a list of recommended policies or policies that we would recommend. So we've seen this slide before. One of the really key things when preserving content, as we've talked about, is co-location, getting all of the pieces together. So if these are all of our files again, and somehow we need to group them together, most preservation agencies will do that through some sort of a packaging and preservation file. So yet another file to add to the mix, which pulls all of these individual files together. And this is a file which has a bit of bibliographic metadata in it, descriptive metadata, usually abbreviated. This is usually where you'd find your Dublin core. So this thing is a book, and here's the author. This metadata file also says things like, Joe scanned it on this date, and it was given to us by Jane, who gave us the preservation rights on this date. But then this file also says, and by the way, here are 12 TIFFs, and TIFF 1 is page 1, and TIFF 2 is page 2, and you put them together this way. And by the way, TIFF 3 isn't valid, so don't be surprised that it doesn't render. And then says the same thing about all of the files in that make up this object. And this is how they're sort of all hooked together, is through this metadata and packaging, the metadata file. There are a couple of standards out here one can use. Premise is the only real metadata standard I know for preservation metadata. Premise was a data dictionary written by a working group. It's now maintained by the Library of Congress. In terms of packaging formats within our community, the library community, the METS is absolutely the gold standard in terms of what is predominantly used. My advice is that if you do something else, that you be able to export to METS. A couple of other options are DIDL, which is the digital item declaration language. It's one part of the MPEG 21 standard, and it's really nice because it's a container standard. This thing contains that kind, contains that thing, which the general and vagueness of it can be really helpful. And then there's the Open Archives Initiative Object Reuse and Exchange, which is not, to my knowledge, widely implemented yet. It is one of the problems we had actually when trying to get content from people, was that they had no way of doing that at this time, because it's not this. ORI was designed to solve that problem, but is not widely implemented yet. So no presentation on preservation is complete without a nod towards rights. I am not a rights expert. I will tell you that just because one has the rights to provide access to a thing does not mean one has the rights to preserve it. We advise you get preservation rights right at the point of time that the item is deposited, so you have them up front, and document those in the preservation metadata. That should be one element of the preservation metadata. There are a couple of areas to be aware are really tricky in regards to rights. Embedded content. This is true of, we know this to be true like in HTML, where there's video embedded in the HTML page, but PDF actually is really lax and allows one to embed all sorts of things that may or may not have the same content owner as the running text. And for libraries or institutions that are dealing with research subjects, privacy rights can be a really big issue. One of the institutions we spoke with had a large number of brain scans, and they absolutely couldn't do any preservation for that content outside of the country. Couldn't happen. So it's just something to think about. I got like 3 slides, and I'm going to go through them really quickly because I want to leave some time for questions. So costs, startup, annual costs, think about them right up front. We actually provide a little worksheet that folks can use at the same place as the handouts to help you. If that's not a calculation that's been done before or you do all the time, could be helpful. Some options for recovering costs. I can't take any credit for these. I actually got them off the archive. The Cornell University Library archive, the physics repository, when they were thinking about how to fund the repository, and Cornell University Library grabbed them from the Ithaca SNR survey that was done a little bit ago. And then my second to last slide here, preservation models. What are some organizational models for preservation? One is to do it yourself, but I'll be brutally honest and say preservation of the ilk we have been talking about here, that is way at that far end of the spectrum. National libraries could do it, well-funded academic libraries could do it. I'm not sure anyone else really can at that broad end of the spectrum. Now, lots of content probably doesn't need to be there, so that's probably okay. Another model is collaboration. We saw this a number of times in the survey and the study when we were talking to people, where folks were sharing a DSpace instance or even a LOCKSS private network and working with peers to distribute the costs which can be really helpful. And then there is this option of a third-party preservation service. So I'm going to leave us with the little flower of the six petals here for preservation service, and we'll see if we can't chunk through some of these questions that are coming in here, and encourage more. It's a little weird not to be doing it in person. I'm going to flip back to the slide actually with the URL on it for people. I'll start there, and then we'll chunk through. I'll take a look at some of these questions. We'll see what we can do. And let's see. Oh dear, dear, dear. All right, I'll flip back quick. Okay, so some of our questions here. Audio. Any suggestions for calculating throughput needs? We tend to calculate throughput needs in two ways, our average and our peak. And so, it's very slow clicking here. So we like to think about, to look at, how much do we do on average? And we have the capacity to look back over, over a year or 2 years and do that calculation. But even after a week of having a student scanning things in, you'll have a sense of how much you're going to be able to get done. And that's going to give you an average, and then you can think about what your peaks are. And once you get those two numbers, that's just sort of a question to put right in front of a repository service. Look, I know I am going to create 20 items a week. How can I load them in? Do I have to load them in 2 at a time? Or 1 at a time, or can I load all 20 in? But we like to look at both of those numbers, both the average and the peak, because to be honest, we have been caught in the not calculating for the peak. I find Deja Vu a trouble format, but it is an open format. What do you think of this conflicting situation? Yeah, just because something's open doesn't mean it's easily preservable or maintained over time. I don't find that to be a discrepancy. I think a lot of it would depend upon the needs of your users and your community. So, at Portico, we accept a lot of content into the archive, and we've got hundreds of different formats in there, including executables and stata data files, and content that honestly we don't have a grand preservation plan for. We're byte replicating right now, and we will continue to do that, and we have hopes that those in the statistics community will solve the stata data problem, long-term preservation issues. If you're looking at Deja Vu and it's particularly difficult for you, I think the questions to look at are, how unhappy would your community be if you migrated it to something else? Would they look at you and say, that is completely unacceptable, I don't care that it's better to preserve, I can't use it the way I want to use it? In which case, it might not be the right choice. But I tend to advocate very practical decisions in that regard. What method do you suggest for acquiring preservation rights at the point of deposit? It depends a little bit, I think, on what kind of content you're working with. So with Portico, we're signing license agreements with publishers. So before we won't touch any content till that agreement is in place, and our ingest system is such that content actually can't get into the archive unless there's a copy of the license agreement actually in the archive. For an institution which has users sort of just depositing things on their own, boy, that is probably a question best answered by your legal counsel on what's the right phraseology essentially for the T&C. to make sure that the rights obligation is put in the right place and on the user and not the institution itself. How am I doing? Okay. Any of the challenges with creating, managing surveyed institutions, financials mentioned, any of the challenges with creating, managing, and preserving metadata for digital collections and solutions? It depends. A lot of the folks we spoke with were using Content VM or DSpace. There were a few using Fedora, and in those instances, you know, the institutions are really driven by what the repository allows to put in regards to metadata. If you're not going into a system that's going to have those kind of requirements, you're doing something on your own. There was one institution we talked with. They had this great system running on Drupal that they built. I would look to the content community. So if you're looking at, if you've got a collection of slides, art slides, then I would go look at the art community, because there will be robust metadata standards already extant for that community. And that will be true for most communities. And you probably want your robust metadata format to match what the community does. And then you can dumb it down into Dublin Core or something else to allow for easier management across the whole. So if into your system you're loading art slides and journal articles, you probably don't want your system to be implementing it to be able to understand the robust metadata file, because that's really collection or content specific. So you'll want an abbreviated Dublin Core metadata record. And I didn't quite get through all of the questions. There's not too many more. I'm going to pop this, because we've hit 3 o'clock. I'm going to move this back over to Pamela, which I think is my next task here, and I'll work to see if I can't answer these. We'll either find somewhere to post them, and feel free to just sort of reach out to me. I'm happy to offer opinions on most anything. Okay, thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you, Amy, for an excellent overview of the results from the Portico-Cornell study and for ideas and suggestions that our institutions should take into consideration as they begin or continue to do preservation planning and developing digitization projects of their locally significant collections. Later today, you will receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to fill it out and return it to us. Your comments will help us to plan Preservation Week events in the future, as well as other continuing education offerings on a wide array of subjects. The 2011 Preservation Week celebration continues tomorrow with a webinar by Bill Lefurgy sharing his expertise on preserving your digital personal memories. There is still time to register for this session if you haven't already done so. Registration is through the ALCTS website. Between now and the ALA Annual Conference, ALCTS will host 4 more webinars. Details may be found online and on your screen. We are always interested in exploring new topics. So if you have suggestions for a webinar, please contact me at pblue@umaryland.edu, or feel free to submit a proposal using the ALCTS proposal form on the website. As we sign off this afternoon, I would like to thank Ithaca again for sponsoring today's webinar, and we look forward to additional collaborative efforts in the future. Thank you as well to Felicity Dicus, a member of the CE Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee, for providing technical support for today's session, and to Jacqueline Howard in the ALCTS office for helping out as well. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to welcoming you at another ALCTS webinar in the future.